Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and this will be episode 37. And today we're going to talk about the Hail Flutie play. And how many of you know where the term Hail Mary came from? It's actually kind of has a long history. I thought I knew the answer, as most of you probably think you do too, but really it's traced all the way back as far as 1922. There's references to Hail Mary plays in college football with Notre Dame back then, but probably the one you're thinking about and the one that I thought about was Roger Staubach in 1975 threw a desperation pass of 50 yards to Drew Pearson against the Minnesota Vikings, December 28th, 1975. They needed a 50-yard touchdown with only 24 seconds left on the clock, and Staubach threw Pearson a pass. Pearson caught it, stepped into the end zone. They get the win. And after the game, Staubach said something to the effect of, "I just said a Hail Mary and threw it." So the media picked up on that, and it's really been used since then the most. But as far as I can see, there's references back farther than that, just so you know. So anyway, today is about another Hail Mary, except this one's called the Hail Flutie. And so we're going to go back to November 23rd, 1984. Prime time, by the way, in the Gen Xers wheelhouse. 1984 was just a huge year in pop culture. We're talking movies, we're talking music, we're talking sports. 1984, man, was the year, I'm telling you. Thanksgiving weekend, November 23rd, 1984. Boston College versus Miami, the Hurricanes. A warm afternoon in Miami at the Orange Bowl, and one of the most unforgettable plays in college football history evolved that day. And it's the game that made Doug Flutie a household name and a legend. This 5'9" quarterback who defied every bit of the odds, and launched this Hail Mary play. And he really defied the odds as far as his career went in other ways. And so it wasn't just a touchdown pass. This was a moment that really became part of our larger sports mythology, one of the top moments in college football history ever. So, story time. It's 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. MTV was in full swing. Some of the movies that were showing that year were things like Ghostbusters and The Terminator in theaters. And college football, for the most part, was still a very regional-based sport. It was really just starting to gain some footing in national television as an audience because you were getting more national matchups to watch weekly. So at the time, the Hurricanes, they were the new rising powerhouse on the block because of Jimmy Johnson. They had the swagger, they had the speed, they were flashy, and they were brash, and they were in your face. And Jimmy encouraged that, and that's what they excelled at. And I've said this before on here, they put the foot down on the pedal and they didn't let go. And so Jimmy Johnson had turned the Hurricanes basically into a team that everybody loved to hate, unless you obviously were a Hurricane fan. So it's worth talking about how Jimmy got to this point with the Hurricanes, because it was actually his first season as the Hurricanes coach. The year before, the Hurricanes had won the national championship under head coach Howard Schnellenberger. But after the 83 championship game, he left unexpectedly to go to the USFL. So here comes Jimmy Johnson, and this season was his first. But among the pressure of being the coach for a defending national champion, of course, there's a lot of high expectations, and Jimmy was very in your face and so forth. But no one really knew what to expect in some ways. And so Jimmy came in. He had a quarterback named Bernie Kosar, and they emphasized the pass because they had so much speed. And so they were averaging 30 points per game under Bernie Kosar and Jimmy's passing attack. Now, to keep the tradition alive of this juggernaut that Howard Schnellenberger had just won the national title with, Jimmy and company, they did start out the season like they should have, according to the fans. They started out 8-0. So it doesn't get much better than that to start the season when you're the new coach for a defending national champion. And among those wins, they had beaten teams like Auburn, Florida, Notre Dame. So they had some big wins, and they're sitting there at 8-0 at one point. However, the wheels did start to fall off, though. After starting that season 8-0 with the 8th win was against Louisville in Miami, then the trouble started. The following week, they played their rival, Florida State, on November 3rd, and they lost that game 41-17. And so, here's Jimmy. They start out 8-0, but then they lose to their biggest rival at the time, Florida State. And so that sets the stage for what happens next. On November the 10th, so 2 weeks before this game, Miami had gone to Maryland. Actually, the game was in Miami. My fault about that. That was played in Miami. And they led them 31-0 at halftime. But Maryland had a quarterback named Frank Reich. And Frank Reich, if you'll remember, was the backup to Jim Kelly on those great Buffalo Bills teams. Frank Reich led a 31-point comeback and came back to beat the Hurricanes 42-40. At the time, I think the greatest point-wise comeback in NCAA football history. Frank Reich owned it. And if you'll remember, years later, he did the same thing in the pros and had the greatest professional comeback. And he was the guy that had both. So I don't think that's true anymore. I think since then, the Vikings, with maybe Kirk Cousins or somebody, have beaten his NFL comeback record. But still, that's quite a feat. So Jimmy and company lost that game after having a 31-point lead. They lost that game and then had a bye week. So they've been stewing for 2 weeks, about how badly they're wanting to beat Doug Flutie and the Boston College Eagles. So you just need to understand that there was a lot of momentum for Miami, and then they lost that controversial game, and then they had to wait 2 weeks to play Boston College. So that was the situation awaiting, Doug Flutie and his teammates. I just think it's really important to understand what they were walking into when they got to Miami that Saturday, or that Friday, actually. Meanwhile, you got this polar opposite over here, Boston College, the Eagles. This is a small Catholic school, not exactly known as a football powerhouse at the time, but they had a kid from Massachusetts named Doug Flutie who was kind of rewriting the script of quarterbacks in college, because time had given way at that point to the tall pocket passers. And, that wasn't who he was. He was 5'9". Now, there were still some wishbone quarterbacks out there who were 5'9", and they were doing their thing, but that wasn't Flutie. Flutie was a balanced all-around quarterback doing his thing. And so by Thanksgiving weekend, both teams were good. They were really good. Boston College was ranked 10th in the nation and had an 8-2 record. This is an 11-game season back then. Miami was 12th in the nation. Both teams had Heisman-level quarterbacks. Besides Doug Flutie for Boston College, you had Bernie Kosar for Miami. It's important to remember that back then, the bowl schedules were predetermined by matchups for conferences and so forth. And so this wasn't a hand-picked playoff. You had to have the absolute best record you could have, and you had to have the most wins you could pile up in order to qualify for some of the bowl games, or for the bowl game in your conference that could possibly lead to a national championship. So every win counted. And this was the last game of the season. This was that Thanksgiving weekend when you wind down the college football season traditionally. This was also, keep in mind, this was the 3-channel days. This was pre-cable having college football. It was a big deal to play on national television, because the sport was growing, and you really wanted to be on national TV for recruiting purposes. And there was one more factor. It was nationally televised on CBS. And here's the big one. It was the day after Thanksgiving, a huge audience sitting around the house. And so this was a spotlight moment before all the other games of the weekend were even going to be played. And so even though Flutie was known up in the Northeast, he was on his way to really the whole country knowing who he was. So from the very beginning, this game was a shootout. This was all offense and not much defense. Miami's offense was loaded. They had Kosar with receivers. Eddie Brown was one of them that I remember, but there was a guy named Stanley Shakespeare as well. They were extremely fast. Boston College, they played fast and aggressive as well, and they proved early on in the game that they weren't intimidated. And so here in this Orange Bowl atmosphere where the crowd was really loud, really crazy, and at some point Miami had the record for most home wins over a couple years span, and I don't remember the exact years, or over a several year span actually. The temperature was only in the 70s, and you think Miami, wow, you'd think it'd be a lot hotter. But the thing was, it was very humid that day. It was really humid. And so classic, South Florida football weather. And so they started trading punches from the opening kickoff, and at the half, the score was tied 21-21, and Flutie had already thrown for 300 yards. Now, 300 yards doesn't sound like much today and a half. Sounds like plenty of guys could do that. That was a huge deal back then, okay? Keep in mind, this was the era of mostly low-scoring games, too, where really 28 points was a lot and 35 was something else. And so 21-21 at the half with a quarterback having 300 yards, that's a shootout. But, this was Miami, their home field, and Kosar was good for a reason. He's matching Flutie throw for throw. And so when the second half started, the Hurricanes came out and they struck first with a score. But Boston College, they just kept coming back. And, few punts, a little bit of defense only, no time to breathe. Keep in mind, Flutie wasn't supposed to be able to keep up with this, but he was carving them up. He was that, Miami's defenses were talented too, and they were fast and they were aggressive, but he was carving them up, and if nothing else, on guts, And so by the fourth quarter, everybody watching at home knew they were watching a special game, and I was watching at home for sure. I remember watching this game, and if I'm not mistaken, my dad and I were watching it, and it just kept, it's one of those games you love. If you're going to be high scoring like that, man, go blow for blow, back and forth, and that way at the end, man, whoever's got the ball last is probably going to win the game, right? So at one point in the fourth quarter, with about 4 minutes left, Boston College had a chance to drive a long way, go on a long drive and kind of ice the game, but it eventually, short passes and scrambles and so forth, the clock running, eventually stalled out. And so with just 28 seconds left in the game, Miami scored, and they were up 45-41, and that looked like the end. It was over. And everybody, I think, believed that except Boston College, because Flutie wasn't done yet. He took the field for that final drive with no timeouts, 80 yards to go, and 28 seconds left in the game. So the first play, he threw a completion. He threw another completion. And just like that, Boston College was at midfield, and they had 8 whole seconds left to go with the ball on Miami's 48-yard line. One play left. And I can see this play in my mind right now talking about it. One play left. Flutie dropped back. I don't know if it was a 7-step drop or what, but he dropped back, and then the defense up the middle kind of surged on him a little, and he rolled just a little bit to his right from what I remember, and then he launched it. And, this dude's 5'9", and 5'9" guys aren't necessarily supposed to be able to throw one that far. But right there through that Florida muggy hot night, the ball went 60-plus yards through the air and all the way to the end zone. And downfield, his best friend, his roommate on the road named Gerard Phelan, had gotten behind everybody. Don't ask me how. Go back and look at the video that I'll provide a link for the YouTube shot. Somehow, this guy got behind him. What's the number one rule in playing prevent defense on a Hail Mary? Don't let anybody behind you, and don't bat the ball up would be rule number 2. Somehow Gerard Phelan got behind everybody, and the ball went right over the fingertips of the Miami guys and right into Gerald Phelan's arms. Touchdown. Final score, Boston College 47, Miami 45, and obviously the only people that went crazy over that were the Boston College fans in attendance. I just kind of have this image of Flutie kind of rocked back on his back foot and launching that to get everything, all the momentum he could into that throw, because that's kind of how they used to teach us to throw with momentum. You kind of rock back and then rock forward. Now they teach you to sort of twist at the waist. It's a whole different world. But what a play. And it instantly became known as obviously a big Hail Mary pass, but a lot of people called it the Hail Flutie. CBS cameras were on hand and caught all the pandemonium, of course. The Boston College band rushed the field, obviously not too early like the Stanford band did. They rushed the field when it was over and appropriate, and just unbelievable chaos. I remember Brett Musburger was calling the game, and he said something about witnessing history. And then within a few hours of that, Doug Flutie's name was everywhere in the sports landscape of the United States. It was everywhere. He was on the front page of sports pages the next day all over the country. He was on NBC's Today Show, everywhere. The 24-hour news cycle wasn't born yet, but the next morning it really cranked up all over the country. That throw was on a loop at most during most sports segments of the evening news. And so for Gen X fans, this was a huge event. Once again, that's the only ones I talk about, right? You know where you were when you saw it. It was one of those kind of moments. I looked up some quotes about it and stuff, and it was compared to the Miracle on Ice. It's been compared to Kirk Gibson's home run in the World Series. You just know where you were when you saw it happen. A week later, Doug Flutie won the Heisman Trophy back when it really meant something to win the Heisman Trophy. It was, I don't think back then politics were involved. I mean, sports politics, like what school you came from. A lot of that was thrown out, and you gave it to the deserving guy, and Flutie certainly deserved it. He was the first Boston College player to ever win the Heisman. And let's be honest with ourselves, probably he won the Heisman the moment that ball landed in the end zone in his buddy's hands, right? So, but he won the Heisman for probably because of that. But, he also had led his team to a top 10 ranking. Let's not forget that. So on top of everything else, his own personal notoriety, there was something that came out of that called the Flutie effect. And that's what people started calling the surge of national attention that Boston College got after the game. Applications at Boston College for students skyrocketed. Enrollment rose dramatically over the next few years. That one thing in a sports setting really put Boston College on the map as a school beyond sports and football. And, for Flutie, that was a defining moment in a long career that was far from over. I mean, even if it had stopped right there, that would have been something. But dude had a lot more left. And some notable Boston College players that day on the roster was Doug Flutie, of course. But he had a brother named Darren Flutie, who was a freshman wide receiver on the team as well. And they had a receiver also on the team named Kelvin Martin. And Cowboys fans remember him because he was very important to the early Jimmy Johnson teams that won the Super Bowls. Kelvin Martin was the third receiver for the Cowboys and a return specialist. On defense that season, Boston College had a guy named Bill Romanowski that I know you've heard of. And here's an interesting little trivia nugget is also on that team was a big defensive end named John Bosa. And John Bosa is the father of Nick and Joey Bosa, who are currently in the NFL. At the end of the season, there were 4 different guys drafted into the NFL from Boston College, and their head coach was named Jack Bicknell, and Bicknell had a son who was actually the center on the team and was out there on the field during the Hail Flutie play. So that's a cool little piece of history for their family. Doug Flutie finished as the player of the year from 3 different voting organizations that year. He was a consensus first-team All-American. And when he left, I didn't know this, but when he left college, he was the NCAA's all-time passing leader with 10,500 yards. As a team, Boston College finished the season 10-2. They ranked number 4 at the end of the season in the coaches poll. They ranked number 5 in the AP polls. And after the miracle in Miami, they got a trip to Dallas to the Cotton Bowl for their troubles, and they beat the Houston Cougars, who were the champions out of the old Southwest Conference. And so Boston College took care of them in the Cotton Bowl and finished with that end of the season number 4 ranking in the coaches poll, number 5 in the AP poll. So back in those days when there was not a whole lot of undefeated teams, really, 10-2, kind of coming out of nowhere. That was a big season, a historic season, not only for Doug Flutie, but for Boston College. So what kind of career did he have? Well, so let's look at his timeline. In 85, when he finished up at Boston College, he went straight to the USFL, which if there's ever a topic I want to do a podcast on, it's the USFL. But he played for the New Jersey Generals only in 1985. In 1986, he ended up in the NFL just like all the other USFL guys with the Chicago Bears. With the Bears, he only played, it looks like, in 4 games. He had about 380 yards passing. He joined in the middle of the season after being in the USFL, and that was at the end of Jim McMahon's run with the Bears. He stayed with the Bears in 86. In 87 and 88, he was with the New England Patriots, and it looks like he played in about 12 games there, had, decent numbers. He started part-time. He wasn't the guaranteed starter, so he only started part-time. And after the 88-89 season, when his contract was up, he went to the CFL. So in the CFL, the Canadian Football League, he started off with the BC Lions, and he played 33 games for them. And he led the passing in both of led the league in passing both seasons there, in 33 games with the BC Lions. In 92 through 95, he played for the Calgary Stampeders, and he won the 1992 Grey Cup and was the CFL's most outstanding player as a Calgary Stampeder in 66 games. He passed for 20,000 yards. Okay. So then, contract time, in 96, he goes to the Toronto Argonauts, who were a big deal back then. They were getting some NFL talent for sure. And he won back-to-back Grey Cups with the Toronto Argonauts. So he had three Grey Cups from 92 to 97. He was the MVP in 1996. He was the MVP in 1997 when he won those 2 Grey Cups. And he passed for about 12,000 yards in 34 games in the CFL. So he passed for 42,600 yards in the CFL. After that, he went back to the NFL in 1998, and through 2000, he was with the Buffalo Bills. With the Buffalo Bills from 98 to 2000, he passed for 7,500 yards, and he was the NFL Comeback Player of the Year in 1998. He made the Pro Bowl in 1998, and he led the Bills to the playoffs. After that contract was up, he went to the San Diego Chargers. I knew he had been with the Chargers. From 2001 to 2004, he played with the Chargers and really was just a backup there. And he went back to the New England Patriots, played a season for them in 2005, and retired afterwards. And here's some trivia for you that I had a note to mention. He famously, under Bill Belichick, asked for and got permission to complete a drop kick, point after, a PAT drop kick, the last one that's been done in NFL history. That's where you have to kick the ball as soon as it hits the ground. It looks like a punt, but the ball actually has to hit the ground, and you kick it as it hits the ground. And he's the last person to complete one of those back in 2005. Before he did that, I'm going to guess it had been 50 years since it had been done. So anyway, that's Doug Flutie. Doug Flutie was a guy that, no, he wasn't the star like a Deion or Barry Sanders or Walter Payton or any of that. But the guy left his legacy just because of guts and the fact that he hung around 20 years nearly after a college career, just really doing his thing in Canada and being a really good, serviceable backup in the NFL in between stints as being actually a starter in the NFL. So the guy put together a heck of a career, and it was one that shouldn't have happened anyway, according to the NFL norms at the time. And so he's a significant part of Gen X football history. You know, it's one of those replays that when you see it, it kind of gives you the chills. And the thing is, he's such a short dude, man. He's 5'9", and for college standards, to be a passing quarterback, like I said, that was not normal. It's just one of those cinematic plays. It proves that that kind of stuff can happen. And 40 years later, here we are talking about it. And Flutie, he went on to be a little bit of a cultural phenomenon himself later on in the NFL. Anybody remember Flutie Flakes, which was kind of like Wheaties that he ended up with for a charity that he funded? That was a big deal. I think sports card collectors still grab a box of Flutie Flakes when they can get their hands on them. And he really wasn't supposed to be a professional quarterback. He just wasn't. Back then, guys like Vinny Testaverde were 6'3", 6'4", with the cannon arm, and they stood in the pocket, and they were phasing out. Wishbone quarterbacks were still in college football, don't get me wrong, but the pro leagues, they did not want those guys. They had no use for them in the NFL, and they converted them to running backs and receivers and D-backs and things like that if they gave them a shot at all. Flutie, though, was a legit passer, a legit pocket passer at 5'9", and that was very different at that moment. He wasn't supposed to be that, but that's what he honed his craft up in Canada. And when he came back down to the NFL, it was bounced around a little bit as a starter and as a backup, and was really good at what he did. So he's the perfect underdog story. That's what I'm trying to say. And everybody loves an underdog, and that's the kind of thing that makes us fall in love with sports in the first place. That play is still telecast and replayed every Thanksgiving weekend on the national telecast. Sports networks, highlight reels, documentaries. It's just one of those moments that they show anytime that you want to talk about a collegiate college football sports memory. And, for Gen X fans who remember watching it, it's one of those things. It's all about what we love, right? Passion and unpredictability and the idea that anything can happen in a ball game. I think that's one of the things we love about the sport. And the Hail Flutie will always be one of the biggest plays in college football history, and we Gen Xers got to view it firsthand for ourselves on the day after Thanksgiving, all the way back in 1984. As usual, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to my foolishness and all my guys with me. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate it if you would click a like, click a comment, click subscribe, whatever you can do. And that'll let us know you enjoy what we do. And we appreciate you listening, and we'll talk in a week. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.